A glass display case at the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia houses an artifact with the catalog number U.10436. It is a human skull that was excavated from the ground in what is now Iraq nearly a century ago. It has an extremely elongated occipital region and lacks the typical anatomical proportions characteristic of our species. Displayed next to it is a massive gold headdress consisting of heavy gold leaves and ribbons. This precious artifact was found lying directly on the bones during the initial excavations of the site. This object belonged to a woman whom we now call Queen Pwabi. Her remains were discovered by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in 1928. Workers stumbled upon the untouched tomb while digging about 40 feet below the desert surface. The excavation site was located approximately 19 miles southwest of the modern city of Nasiriyah. The burial chamber itself covered an area of several hundred square feet and was filled with dozens of bodies. This exhibit sits quietly on a shelf while tour guides tell visitors about the splendor of Sumerian jewelry. People walk past the display case every day, admiring the blue lapis lazuli on the heavy headdress. Few pay attention to the structure of the bones that served as the biological foundation for this royal crown. But the physical structure of these bones is documented in official reports and available for independent scientific analysis. This data makes us wonder who the elite of early Sumerian society really were. This skull raises one very specific question that goes beyond mere archaeological curiosity. How could a biological organism naturally form such a bone structure without surgical intervention or genetic pathology? We will not attempt to provide a definitive answer to this complex anatomical problem at this time. Our task is simply to examine the physical data lying before us in the museum's glass display case. We will analyze every detail of this object, relying solely on documented facts and official measurements in inches. For many years, I studied reports on expeditions to the Middle East without paying due attention to the anatomical summaries. The texts spoke of gold, of palaces, of ancient cuneiform tablets, and I accepted this order of priorities. But one day, I saw the profile of skull U.10436 in an old catalog of Leonard Woolley's excavations. I looked at it for a long time before allowing myself to ask the obvious question. Today, we will follow the same path, relying only on what can be physically measured and verified. Official archaeology offers a clear and well-defined explanation for this anatomical feature of the early Sumerian queen. According to the consensus, Pwabi's unusual skull shape is the result of the practice of artificial skull deformation in early childhood. This process involves tightly bandaging the infant's head with cloth bandages or attaching rigid wooden splints. A newborn's bones are soft enough that, under constant external pressure, they can alter the direction of their natural growth. As a result, the head takes on an elongated shape, which in ancient cultures often served as a marker of high social status. This interpretation is well-founded. It is supported by hundreds of documented examples of similar practices among the peoples of South America, Egypt, and other ancient civilizations. Artificial deformation is indeed a historical fact, confirmed by numerous archaeological finds across the globe. It is logical to assume that the ruling elite of the city of Ur used this method to visually distinguish their representatives. But it does not explain the following fundamental physical contradiction that becomes apparent upon precise measurement of the object. The official version also attempts to explain the absence of the sagittal suture by a rare medical condition known as craniosynostosis. This condition causes premature fusion of the skull bones while still in the womb or in the very first months of life. Medical statistics show that craniosynostosis is extremely rare and always leads to severe facial deformities. The condition blocks skull growth in one direction, forcing it to compensate for the volume in another, which inevitably causes asymmetry. Puabi's skull, on the other hand, exhibits perfect symmetry between the left and right halves, accurate to the smallest fractions of an inch. We are faced with a situation where standard explanations fall apart when confronted with concrete numbers and measurements. The theory of artificial deformation is refuted by the absence of pressure marks and a physically impossible internal volume. The theory of a genetic disorder is refuted by the perfect symmetry and the absence of signs of increased pressure on the bone. To understand the true nature of this anatomy, we must turn to other physical evidence from that era. Our investigation moves from the single skull in Philadelphia to anatomical details hidden in museum archives. Let's take a detailed look at the macro photographs of the occipital region of specimen U.10436, held in the archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum. These images were taken in 1932, immediately after the completion of restoration work on the find. They capture the texture of the bone tissue in high resolution, revealing the geometry of the frontal and parietal lobes. You can clearly see the angle of the frontal bone, which slopes backward in a smooth, continuous curve. This arc extends over 8 inches, creating a vast space within the cranial cavity. The original anatomical report accompanying the artifact's transfer to the museum contains extremely precise wording on this matter. The records of Sir Arthur Keith, who conducted the initial biometric examination, document the physical distribution of bone mass. The verbatim quote reads, "The geometry of the skull base demonstrates an innate adaptation to increased posterior mass, ruling out external compression." He explicitly points out that the entire biomechanics of this head developed naturally from the moment of conception. These words remained on the pages of old reports, hidden under a layer of library dust in museum archives. It is important to understand the scale of this biological adaptation in the context of the musculature of a woman who lived thousands of years ago. The center of gravity of this elongated skull required a completely different configuration of the cervical vertebrae to support upright posture. The muscle attachment points on Puabi's occipital bone form depressions that exceed the human norm by nearly 40%. The total weight of the preserved skull bones is just over 2 pounds, which is a normal baseline. However, the thickness of the bone itself reaches nearly 1/4 of an inch in places where it is usually half as thick. This increased density was necessary to protect a brain that was 15 cubic inches larger. A 6-pound gold headdress only added to the load on this complex biomechanical system. The entire geometry of the bone screams that it was designed by nature to solve specific balance problems. All these measurements were taken using standard calipers and carefully recorded in inches. These figures are not subject to interpretation or the result of complex computer models that can easily be disputed. They represent the direct physical properties of object U.10436, which exists in our material world. Every line of this geometry was laid out before birth, forming a framework for a brain of incredible dimensions. The measurements in inches refute the bandaging theory with mathematical precision, leaving no room for compromise. We are looking at a bone that followed its own biological laws, ignoring our modern anatomy textbooks. To fully understand the nature of this skull, we must examine the most enigmatic element of its construction. This brings us to the next physical feature, documented in the same museum archives. We return to the archives of the University of Pennsylvania Museum to examine the central anatomical mystery of specimen U.10436. We are referring to the upper part of the cranial vault, captured in macro photographs under proper studio lighting. In the center of the vault, where every normal human has a sagittal suture, we see a completely smooth bone. This monolithic structure extends from the frontal bone to the very back of the head, without a single zigzag-shaped gap. The line of connection, which should be present on any human skull, is completely absent on this particular specimen. Official anatomical science classifies this as the result of extremely early bone fusion, known as craniosynostosis. It is believed that the suture was present at birth, but fused so quickly that it disappeared without a trace. Medical textbooks describe this process as a severe pathology that erases the boundary between the parietal plates. Experts assert that the smooth surface formed due to the complete calcification of the cartilaginous layer in early childhood. Therefore, the absence of the suture is interpreted as an individual genetic disorder specific to one particular woman from the city of Ur. Sir Arthur Keith's original anatomical report contains extremely precise wording on this specific matter. In his notes accompanying the initial examination of the bones, a crucial observation regarding this monolithic structure is documented. The verbatim quote reads, "The complete absence of traces of sagittal division indicates a fundamentally different matrix of vault formation." He made it clear that the bone did not fuse as a result of a disease, but grew as a single dome from the outset. These words remained hidden in archival folders, contradicting modern museum labels diagnosing craniosynostosis. It is important to understand the context of age-related changes in bone tissue to properly assess this physical museum artifact. Complete fusion of the sutures into a perfectly smooth bone sometimes occurs in people of advanced age. Our investigation extends beyond a single museum display case in Pennsylvania. We must determine whether the U.10436 skull is a unique anomaly of nature or part of a broader biological pattern. To do this, we must leave Ur and turn to expedition reports from another region of Mesopotamia. There, beneath dozens of feet of dry earth, archaeologists found something that completely undermines the theory of an isolated disease. This leads us to physical artifacts now stored in archives on the other side of America. Traveling 150 miles north of Ur, we arrive at the excavation site of the ancient city of Kish. In 1923, a joint expedition by the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago and Oxford began work here. They unearthed a necropolis that predated the royal tombs of Ur by several centuries. In the deep layers of dry Iraqi soil, at a depth of more than 30 feet, archaeologists found something they did not expect at all. They recovered a group of skulls that exactly replicated the anatomical anomalies of Queen Puabi. The official archaeological position is that these findings represent simply another group of deformed skulls. It is believed that the tradition of head binding originated in Kish and later spread south to the city of Ur. Curators classify these artifacts as markers of cultural exchange among the elites of early Sumerian city-states. The absence of sagittal sutures in some specimens from Kish is explained by the same theory of a local outbreak of a genetic disease. This position allows both groups of finds to be viewed as part of a single social phenomenon of artificial modification. This interpretation is well-founded. The discovery of similar cultural practices in neighboring cities is a standard pattern in the development of any ancient civilization. Trade routes and dynastic marriages inevitably led to the exchange of traditions, including rituals of altering one's appearance. It is logical to group these findings under the general historical term of cultural body modification to maintain the simplicity of academic classification. But it does not explain the perfect biometric match of the bone structures found in these independent locations. The size of these skulls also defies the basic rules of artificial compression we discussed earlier. The internal volume of the skulls from Kish ranges from 95 to 105 cubic inches. This again exceeds the volume of a standard human skull by a significant margin, requiring a vast amount of additional biological material. These individuals held the highest positions in society, as evidenced by the incredible wealth of their burial goods. They were the elite, whose biology differed radically from the physiology of the common farmers they ruled over. Today, these specimens are divided between repositories in Chicago and the Ashmolean Museum in the UK. They lie in cardboard boxes with inventory numbers written in black ink directly on the frontal bones. Physical objects confirming the existence of humans with brain volumes exceeding 100 cubic inches are available for study. Any anthropologist can take a tape measure in inches and personally verify the angle of the occipital bone. But instead, they remain in the category of unwanted artifacts that disrupt the neat picture of early human history. The Ashmolean Museum in Oxford houses a physical artifact known as the Weld-Blandel prism. This fired clay object, about 8 inches tall, has the official catalog number WB444. It was discovered in 1922 in southern Iraq by Herbert Weld's expedition. On 4 of the prism's faces, a text known as the List of Sumerian Kings is carved in small cuneiform script. This document contains a detailed chronology of the rulers of Mesopotamia, spanning hundreds of generations before and after the Great Flood. Official historical scholarship categorically rejects the early parts of this text as pure political mythology. Scholars claim that the incredibly long reigns of the first kings are merely literary exaggerations by the authors. It is believed that the scribes intentionally stretched the chronology to give their dynasties greater historical and political weight. Any references to the unusual nature of these rulers are classified exclusively as religious metaphors or symbolic titles. The text is viewed as a propaganda tool containing no factual biological information about the rulers. This interpretation is well-founded. Ancient rulers regularly attributed divine origins to themselves to legitimize their absolute power over an uneducated populace. The use of hyperbole and fantastical allegories was the absolute standard of court literature throughout the ancient world. It is reasonable to assume that texts describing reigns lasting thousands of years are not strictly documentary chronicles. But this does not explain the fact that the text uses specific physiological terms to describe this elite. The chronology of these records also perfectly matches modern radiocarbon dating of Queen Puabi's remains. The burials at Ur date to the very same period when, according to the texts, these unique kings reigned. We have an exact match in time, geographical location, and physical characteristics between the text and the bones. This shifts the description from the realm of mythical folklore into the category of documentary recording of anatomical facts. The scribes simply recorded the actual appearance of their rulers, using the full cuneiform vocabulary available to them. The Weld-Blandel prism weighs about 1 pound and fits comfortably in an adult's hands. It is displayed in a glass case in the ancient Near East Hall, accessible for viewing by any curious visitor. The cuneiform signs, pressed into the wet clay with a reed stylus, are clearly visible under proper studio lighting. This is a physical witness to the era that carries information rejected by the curators of that very same museum. The text and the bones tell the same coherent story, one that we stubbornly refuse to listen to. Ancient records confirm what the anatomy of the skull from Ur and the bones from Kish has already shown us. We are not dealing with a local fashion for deformation or a rare epidemic of bone disease. We are looking at the documented reality of a race of rulers whose biology was radically different from ours. Their physical remains lie in museum boxes, and detailed descriptions of their bodies are carved into fired clay. The time has come to assemble all these scattered physical facts into a single coherent picture. We have journeyed from a single object in a display case at the University of Pennsylvania to a sweeping picture of ancient Mesopotamia. every piece of evidence we have examined relies exclusively on documented facts, physical measurements in inches, and direct translations. We have not used conspiracy theories or unprovable hypotheses to analyze these specific historical artifacts. We simply read museum labels, checked catalog numbers, and examined the shape of ancient bone tissue. Now, we must place all this irrefutable physical data on a single research table. Queen Puabi's enlarged cranial capacity, exceeding 100 cubic inches, is documented. The complete absence of a sagittal suture and the perfectly smooth surface of the skull vault of U.10436 are documented. The absence of any microscopic pressure marks from artificial bandaging on the bone surface is documented. The presence of an entire population with identical skull geometry in the deep layers of the ancient city of Kish. Documented. Literal descriptions of rulers with elongated skulls on fired clay cuneiform tablets. Documented. There is no explanation for why all these independent facts point in the same direction. The official model of artificial deformation collapses when confronted with the increased volume and complete absence of bandage marks. The medical model of a genetic disorder collapses in the face of perfect symmetry and the multitude of identical finds in different cities. The textual model of mythological exaggeration loses its meaning in the face of literal physical matches with real bones. The academic system simply refuses to combine these data sets into a single, albeit inconvenient, logical conclusion. Museums prefer to rely on century-old reports written in Wool's time using a simple caliper. Modern analysis could determine the exact brain volume of these people to within thousandths of an inch. But such detailed studies do not receive funding because they might yield incorrect answers. The enemy of truth here is not science in general, but the specific choice to classify an artifact before a full investigation has been conducted. As soon as a bone is officially labeled as artificially deformed, it is permanently excluded from the list of biological anomalies. Once an ancient text is declared a myth, it ceases to be considered a valid source of anatomical data. This classification system creates the illusion of a perfectly comprehensible past, where all findings fit into familiar frameworks. It shields us from the need to acknowledge that there are vast, frightening blind spots in human history. But the physical objects lying in the archives of Chicago, Philadelphia, and Oxford continue to silently resist this classification. They possess a specific weight in pounds and specific dimensions in inches that cannot be altered by administrative decree. Their density, shape, and chemical composition are incredibly stubborn facts of our material world. And these facts clearly indicate that the biology of Sumer's ruling elite does not fit into school textbooks. They were anatomically different, and this biological difference was systemic, not a random glitch of nature. An enlarged brain volume implies the presence of additional neural connections and a completely different cognitive structure. A skull with a volume of over 100 cubic inches would have had to contain a brain significantly heavier than ours. Biology never wastes resources on creating a massive bony shell unless it is filled with functioning tissue. These people physically possessed a brain that was an order of magnitude superior to that of the average farmer of the time. This fundamental biological inequality may have been the true basis of their absolute political power over the region. This explains why the ruling caste of Sumer so strictly controlled its lineage and dynastic marriages. They were not merely defending political titles, lands, or accumulated wealth, as is commonly believed today. They preserved a specific genetic code that provided them with this unique skull configuration and enormous brain. Intermixing with the general population would inevitably have led to the dilution of this trait and the loss of their biological superiority. This is precisely why the absence of sutures and the elongated shape were preserved over many generations in Ur and Kish. A huge gap remains regarding where this specific genetic lineage actually originated in the plains of the Middle East. The paleontological record does not show a smooth evolutionary transition to this skull shape in this hot region. This anatomy appears in the archaeological record suddenly, already in a fully formed, stable, and functional state. It coincides in time with a sharp leap in the development of writing, complex architecture, and mathematics among the Sumerians. The physical bearers of this remarkable anatomy were the very people who built the first civilizations on Earth. We do not draw conclusions about who these rulers were in a global cosmic or mystical sense. We remain strictly within the framework of the physical parameters of bone tissue, inches, pounds, and fired clay tablets. But these parameters irrefutably prove that the official historical picture of Mesopotamia is critically incomplete and fragmentary. We ignore a massive array of physiological data simply because the system does not know what to do with it. And this choice of academic disregard brings us back to the very object from which we began. We return once again to the halls of the University of Pennsylvania Museum in the cool, climate-controlled environment of Philadelphia. Before us stands the same glass display case, brightly illuminated by the soft light of the museum's halogen lamps. Inside rests object U.10436, extracted by Leonard Woolley's expedition from the dry dust of Iraq nearly a century ago. Next to it glimmers a 6-pound gold headdress, created specifically for this monolithic, elongated head. The circle of our investigation has closed, bringing us back to the original, most crucial physical clue. The museum label next to the exhibit still contains the standard informational text of several paragraphs. It confidently informs visitors about the fascinating ancient practice of binding infants' heads with pieces of cloth. It makes no mention of the bone's perfect smoothness, its symmetry, or the insurmountable anatomical contradictions of this form. The text on the label presents a cozy, completely safe version of history that never asks uncomfortable questions. But the bone itself, lying just a few inches from this text, continues to speak the truth silently. This contrast between the official description and physical reality is the essence of the modern archaeological problem. We have the technological capability to examine every atom of this skull, but we collectively choose not to do so. We prefer to maintain the status quo, because revising a single detail could bring down the entire academic construct of history. Admitting that these bones developed naturally would require rewriting entire chapters of human evolutionary anthropology. Therefore, Object U.10436 remains a beautiful display piece, rather than a key to the biology of the past. You are now armed with specific data that most museum visitors have never bothered to seek out. You know that the volume of this skull far exceeds the normal 85 cubic inches. You understand that the smooth surface, devoid of microscopic cracks, rules out the use of wooden plates or tight ropes. Your perception of this object is no longer controlled by the curator's choice to classify the artifact before its full independent examination. You are capable of independently evaluating the physical evidence, relying on logic and direct museum measurements. Our investigation into the anatomy of early Sumerian rulers has reached its logical conclusion. All collected physical data, measurements in inches, and museum records are before you for your own analysis. No one can force you to accept an official or alternative interpretation of these parameters and cuneiform translations. The skull with catalog number U.10436 is on display in a glass case at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The question it raises has never been resolved.